3. Can liberty be auctioned? A. An interest-based argument. We turn at last to our main question. Do liberty and equality conflict under equality of resources? I discussed that conception of equality in Chapter 2, and I need offer only a skeletal summary here. Roughly, it stipulates that an ideal egalitarian distribution will satisfy an appropriately complex version of the envy test. No one will envy the property assigned to or controlled by any other person. That test may be met and equality of resources satisfied ideally, but by a distribution in which people nevertheless have very different levels of welfare or well-being. In an actual society whose citizens differ in productive capacities, the entry test cannot be met fully. Redistributive mechanisms can nevertheless be designed to improve the degree to which it is met. These might take the form, for example, of programs of taxation and redistribution modeled on the insurance decisions that members of the community would make under certain appropriate circumstances. In this and other ways, the envy test provides useful practical guidance. We gain a better grasp of the envy test in action by imagining an artificial mechanism that could achieve a distribution satisfying that test. People on a desert island bid for various groups of the physical resources found there from an initially equal stock of bidding resources like clamshells, and the auction is run repeatedly in successive rounds until everyone is content that it end. If it does end, the envy test is then satisfied because no one envies the overall bundle of resources another has acquired, even though different people are happy or successful in different degrees. The auction provides only an initial distribution, which will be altered by all the post-auction decisions the parties make about trade, production, and consumption. The resources each person holds from time to time, as well as the welfare they provide him, will therefore depend not only on his own decisions, but on those of others as well. This imaginary auction can serve as a rough model in designing political and economic institutions for the real world in search of as much equality of resources as can be found. If we accept equality of resources as the best conception of the abstract egalitarian principle, then we want institutions that make the resources available to any one person depend so far as possible on the opportunity costs of those resources to others, in the way the imaginary auction and post-auction transactions make them so depend. That brief description of equality of resources might seem to suggest that only the interest strategy could succeed in reconciling liberty and equality under equality of resources. Here is the argument that seems to drive us to that conclusion. Equality of resources assumes a fundamental distinction between a person, understood to include features of personality like convictions, ambitions, tastes, and preferences, and that person's circumstances, which include the resources, talents, and capacities he commands. It may seem linguistically inexact to assign a person's physical and mental capacities to his circumstances rather than to his personality, but drawing the distinction that way is important for reasons discussed later in the text. Treating capacities as part of circumstances, however, presents complexities for equality of resources. Capacities cannot be auctioned in the way ordinary material resources can be, nor can they be transferred among persons in pursuit of equality of resources. The hypothetical insurance schemes discussed in Chapter 2 are in large part responses to that problem. A person's welfare and familiar conceptions of welfare is sensitive to both personality and circumstances, but equality of resources aims to make circumstances rather than overall welfare equal, and is in that way different from equality of welfare. It seems undeniable, however, that a person's liberty, the range of actions open to him free from any legal constraint, belongs to his circumstances rather than to his person or personality. Felt moral constraints, on the contrary, belong to personality. A complication therefore arises in virtue of the familiar moral conviction many people have that they ought to obey legal constraints. I avoid this complication by assuming that legal constraints, so far as they belong to circumstances, are to be viewed as Holmes' Batman would view them, as threats raising the cost of the actions they forbid. The general ambition of equality of resources, which is to make circumstances equal under an appropriate version of the Envy test, would therefore seem to apply to liberty as well as to material resources. Legal constraints should ideally be designed and distributed so that no one envies the circumstances of anyone else, taking into account not only his material resources but also the opportunities legal constraints allow him. If that is a sound account of how equality of resources must treat liberty, if it must treat liberty as a resource like any other, then the liberty people will have in an ideal egalitarian distribution must depend on which rights to liberty people generally value, as in their own interests, and on how much they value those rights. Liberty and equality can then be reconciled under equality of resources only if enough people think that the rights to liberty and an adequate conception of liberty would identify are so much in their own interests that each would choose to have that liberty in his own bundle of resources rather than anything else he could have acquired in its place. Equality of resources cannot appeal, as Rawls's method does, to counterfactual choices that people would make of that or that fiduciaries would make for them under circumstances of radical ignorance. For the Envy test is a here and now test. It demands, in its account of ideal distribution, that people with full knowledge of their plans, projects, and attachments not prefer the resources assigned to someone else. Equality of resources insists that people be allowed to deploy all aspects of their personality in making the judgments on which the Envy test depends. If equality of resources must use the interest strategy to reconcile liberty and equality, therefore, it faces an extraordinarily difficult assignment, and the most likely consequence of its attempt to reconcile them is the near total defeat of liberty. Suppose freedom is just another resource, and so part of what is to be sold, along with land and raw materials, in the imaginary auction I described. Some ingenuity is needed to imagine how liberty might be auctioned. Here is one suggestion. Imagine that the auctioneer draws up a list before the auction begins of liberties he believes parties to the auction might find important, and then prints a limited number of cards, something like get out of jail cards in Monopoly, each of which allows the bearer to exercise a particular liberty drawn from that list. One card, for example, would entitle the bearer to attend political rallies or demonstrations. Then the auctioneer sets a price for each liberty card by dividing the estimated cost to the community of protecting each liberty, the cost, for example, of policing political demonstrations by the number of cards for that liberty he has printed. He sells the cards in the general auction at that price. If cards for any liberty remain unsold at the end of any auction round, he puts fewer cards up for sale at a different price reflecting his new cost estimates in the next round. If, on the contrary, all cards for a particular liberty sell in any round at the price fixed for that round, any party may ask that more cards be printed and sold at a different price reflecting the increase in the next round. If the auction finally ends and this procedure has been followed, the auction has distributed liberties in a way that produces an envy-free distribution of liberties and other goods. Under this design, each person is forced to decide how important each liberty is to him. If some particular liberty, like freedom or political association, proved to be very expensive because the cost per card necessary to protect it, for example, was very high, given the number who wished to purchase it, people anxious for that liberty would be in the position of those who want expensive consumer goods like champagne or plover's eggs. They would be required to pay for the expensive liberty, if they could afford it at all, by having much less of other goods or liberties. Some people would buy more liberties of each sort and more liberties overall than others. The envy test would nevertheless be satisfied. A would end the auction with no, A would end the auction with many fewer liberties than B. B might be permitted to speak out on political subjects when A is not, for example. Their circumstances would still be equal overall, judged by the envy test, because A would have material resources that B lacks. The fate of liberty in any post-auction society would therefore depend wholly on the mix of preferences, tastes, convictions, ambitions, and other aspects of personality that happen to be found among the population. If the depressing suspicion I expressed earlier is accurate, that most people are indifferent about at least some of the basic liberties our constitutional traditions celebrate, liberty would not survive the auction in any robust form. Some people would pay the price necessary to guarantee the basic liberties for themselves, but not many would, and that fact alone would increase the price of liberty for those anxious to secure it. No doubt it would be nearly impossible to administer a post-auction society in which people have different liberties. But we cannot appeal to that administrative difficulty as providing any reason to resist the conclusion the present argument seems to have reached. An ideal distribution, under equality of resources, is one in which people have different liberties, some have few liberties, and those who have more liberties have fewer other goods in consequence. If that argument is sound, we must decide which practical schemes of recognizing and denying liberties would come as close as is feasible to that ideal. We could not persuade ourselves that our present constitutional system, which guarantees an important set of liberties for everyone, satisfies that test. Liberty would have a much more modest place in any scheme we could justify as coming as close as possible to the ideal. If equality of resources must treat liberty as another resource, then, far from showing that no conflict exists between liberty and equality, it demonstrates, in a particularly vivid and alarming way, that the conflict between these political virtues is inevitable, and also why it is conflict liberty must lose. B. An important mistake. Fortunately, this apparently devastating argument is fallacious. I described it only to show the serious consequences for equality of resources of trying to rely on the interest strategy to fix the place of liberty in an ideal distribution. In fact, the interest strategy makes no sense with inequality of resources. The argument I constructed supposes that acquiring a particular resource and acquiring rights or opportunities to use that resource are two independent transactions. But no one can intelligently, or even intelligibly, decide what to bid for in an auction or what price to bid for it, unless he makes assumptions about how he will be able to use what he acquires. When you bid for a painting in an auction of art, you assume that you will be able to hang the painting where you like, look at it when you want, and so forth. Any auction requires a background of parallel assumptions constituting what I shall call a liberty constraint system for that auction. The background must stipulate what one acquires in acquiring something at the auction in question, that is, what one can and cannot do with or about it. Even if particular liberties were auctioned in the mad, monopoly card way I imagined, parties could not intelligently decide how much to bid for a particular liberty unless the background stipulated what they could or could not already do without the special liberty that they contemplated buying. So a background or baseline liberty constraint system is essential, and that system will specify whether parties do or do not begin the auction with any particular liberty in hand. Different baselines will produce different auction results, even though the goods auctioned and the tastes and projects of the parties remain the same. If the baseline stipulates that though a party can use clay for any other purpose he likes, he cannot use it to make a politically satirical sculpture, someone will want clay much less than he would without that background constraint, and so bid a much lower price for it. Each baseline decision the auctioneer makes reverberates in that way through the auction as a whole. So he needs a justification for choosing one baseline rather than another. Someone might object that the auctioneer can design a neutral baseline, for which he therefore needs no justification, if he stipulates that the parties begin the auction with no freedom to do anything at all with the goods they acquire. Then anyone who buys something must also buy separately, in a later part of the auction, whatever control he wants over or about it. Someone might buy a pole, for example, and then later, if he wished the right to plant it in his own land, hang a flag from it, and so forth. Is that suggestion coherent? Parties to the auction must often adopt bidding programs in which they bid for one good on the expectation of being able to acquire another later. Someone who likes hot dogs, but only with mustard, must anticipate the price of mustard before he bids for hot dogs, and he might wish to rerun the auction if that price turns out to be significantly greater than he expected. But there is a crucial difference between the relation between owning hot dogs and owning mustard, on the one hand, and that between owning a pole and having the liberty to use it, on the other. Hot dogs and mustard are two different goods, each of which some people, at least, might value apart from the other. But owning a pole and having some set of rights to control its use are essentially only different descriptions of the same thing, as we shall see by trying to imagine how the suggested auction from a supposedly neutral baseline of total constraint would proceed. The auctioneer is meant to hold the auction in two parts. In the first, goods are auctioned, as it were, tout court, with no right to use or touch or even regard to what one has bought. When all goods are distributed in that way, the second part begins. The auctioneer specifies some set of liberties and powers over the goods supposedly auctioned in the first part, adequate to make these goods recognizably private property, and the parties bid for whatever sets of liberties and powers he has specified. But the auctioneer must specify, before the second part begins, exactly which liberties and powers are available in the second part and how these map over the goods sold in the first part. However he does this, his specification becomes the effective baseline for the auction as a whole. It replaces the original, supposedly neutral, baseline of total constraint which actually plays no role in the proceedings. The parties make all bidding decisions, in other words, as if the auctioneer's liberty specification were the original baseline. It might help in appreciating this point to review various choices the auctioneer has available. Suppose he defines the liberties he auctions in the second part of the auction as liberties to use something one has already purchased in the first part, so that liberties are valuable with respect to each good only to the prior purchaser of that good. There will then be no competition for any set of liberties. The holder of any good acquires the specified liberties to use it, all but free. The auction collapses into its first part. The competition is only about who acquires what goods in the first place, and parties will make their bids in the first stage by assuming the liberties to be specified in the second as already attached to goods for which they bid. The liberties specified in the second stage therefore become the effective baseline for the first stage. Suppose, on the other hand, that the auctioneer defines the liberties sold in the second stage as powers to control the use of designated goods no matter who acquired them in the first stage. If I outbid you for rights over your pole, it is I, not you, who decides what can be hung from it. Then the auction collapses into the second part. No one would bid anything for a useless title, whose benefit is wholly at risk, with no advantage to the holder in a later competition. The liberties sold in the second stage then become, once again, the assumed baseline of the entire auction. In each of these cases, and in any other we could construct, the upshot is the same. No matter how and when liberties are specified, parties make decisions as if these were specified as an original baseline. Since they cannot be specified in a way that has no impact on the auction, any specification needs the kind of justification I explore in the next several sections of the text. Of course, after the supposedly two-part auction is finished, the auctioneer can change the baseline system he has in effect imposed by specifying the liberties sold in the second part somewhat differently and running the auction again. But the second run then becomes a different auction, an auction from a different background liberty constraint system. The auctioneer cannot escape deciding which baseline system, from among those that define a recognizable scheme of private property, he is justified in adopting. See a fresh start. So the interest strategy argument I constructed, which ends in the doom of liberty, begins in a serious confusion. Though liberty is indeed part of one's circumstances rather than one's person or personality, the liberty an egalitarian state provides cannot be wholly settled by action like private decisions, because any action presupposes a liberty constraint system of some kind already in place. So the interest strategy is alien to the general structure of equality of resources. That conception of equality makes people's interests relevant only at the level of the auction it imagines. But fundamental decisions about liberty figure at a prior level, the level at which the auction is designed rather than held. That technical requirement of the auction device signals a fundamental characteristic of equality of resources. The envy test is itself interest-based. People have their own interests in mind when they judge whether they prefer the resources available to anyone else to those available to them. But the envy test presupposes a liberty constraint system and cannot be used to yield one. For any set of background stipulations we suppose about what people will or will not be free to do with the resources they acquire, the envy test will be satisfied by a successful auction against that background. If the background stipulates that no one may use any of the resources he acquires, except in a few enumerated ways, the envy test will be met. People will make choices with those serious constraints on liberty in mind, and by hypothesis will not prefer any bundle of resources anyone else chooses given the same constraints. If the background stipulates a much larger scope of freedom of choice, The bundle each chooses will be a different bundle, but once again the auction, if successful, will produce an envy-free distribution. Since the envy test is in that way indiscriminate among systems of liberty and constraint, the interest strategy cannot possibly succeed. It is wholly misconceived. Equality of resources, in other words, requires two stages of analysis, of which the envy test and the imaginary auction designed to satisfy it represent only the second. At the first, or baseline, stage, the auction is structured by providing a background baseline system against which the auction unfolds. So the definition equality of resources offers of an ideal egalitarian distribution must include a specification of the liberties essential to equality. The envy test, as we just saw, cannot provide the entire definition of an ideal distribution. Since that test is compatible with an indefinite number of different distributions, since it is compatible, that is, with an indefinite number of distributions a successful auction from equal initial resources might produce, it can provide only a necessary condition for an ideal distribution. A liberty constraint system is part of what is needed to complete a set of sufficient conditions. An auction baseline must, of course, address questions other than those about liberty and constraint. I emphasize a different aspect of the baseline in Chapter 2, where I said that the baseline for the imaginary auction must specify the form in which the available resources are to be auctioned. Suppose the auctioneer was able to make non-reversible trades with neighboring islands, and, in spite of the fact that some of the parties to the forthcoming auction disliked plover's eggs, traded all the goods of the island, before the auction, into only a large number of those delicacies. The resulting auction would yield an envy-free distribution, but the procedure would be flawed, and the results would not constitute an ideal egalitarian distribution, because proper baseline assumptions about the form of the resources to be auctioned would have been violated. Some baseline issues about the goods to be auctioned are more difficult than the question whether the auctioneer should trade a mix of resources for plover's eggs. Do the goods to be auctioned include, for example, parts of the bodies of the parties, so that each party would have to bid for his own eyes against competitors who might wish to use his eyes for their own purposes? In Chapter 2, I made heavy weather of another issue I presented as an issue about what goods are to be auctioned, the question whether rights over labor are among such goods. I now think this is better treated as an issue about the baseline liberty constraint system. The argument of this chapter provides a better, because less ad hoc, argument for the conclusion I reached earlier, that rights over one's labor and leisure are not included in the auction. It follows from all this that equality of resources must fall back on the constitutive strategy if it hopes to reconcile its version of equality with any adequate conception of liberty. It must show that the most appropriate baseline liberty constraint system for achieving equality provides the rights that an adequate conception of liberty requires. We shall consider a constitutive argument with that ambition in the next two sections. If that argument is successful, then an attractive conception of liberty flows from the very definition of an egalitarian distribution, and so liberty and equality cannot conflict. But we should first tie a loose end. I have been arguing that any auction needs a liberty constraint baseline, which cannot be neutral and so must be justified as appropriate to equality of resources. But devices can no doubt be found for changing the liberties and constraints the baseline provides by putting at least some of these up for auction. When I was constructing the bad, interest-based argument I later rejected, which supposed that liberty could be auctioned from a neutral base, I imagined special monopoly card liberties, and I speculated about how prices could be set and an auction conducted for these. No doubt other devices for varying the baseline scheme could be imagined as well. Does the spirit of equality of resources require the auctioneer to conduct such baseline modifying auctions? No, it forbids them. I have labored the point that any baseline will be consequential for the auction. Different baselines will provide different results even when resources, tastes, and ambitions remain the same. The auctioneer must select whichever baseline best serves the aims of equality of resources. Suppose he judges that the appropriate baseline system does not include the freedom to discriminate on racial grounds. He must not later auction monopoly cards permitting racial discrimination, for that would place in an unfair position those who would be put at a disadvantage by others having that liberty. They must decide whether to buy as many of the Liberty cards themselves as they can afford, in spite of the fact that they would not use them. If they buy them all, Then the remainder of the auction proceeds from the baseline the auctioneer established, but no longer among people with equal resources, because they have had no use some of their clamshells simply to preserve that baseline. If they do not, then the remaining auction is no longer against that baseline. Remember that the loss of liberty affects prices and opportunities for others as well, and so is no longer warranted for an egalitarian result.